Hi everyone. So I got a text message this morning, early in the morning when I woke up, and it was quite interesting. It was sent by a friend of mine who is very active in the Buddhist temple in San Francisco. And he said, last night when I put my oldest son to bed to sleep, he asked me about where the first man came from. Because he said a friend of his, another kid I suppose, brought a book to class, and it talks about the first man were actually Adam and Eve, and they were created by God. And so my friend says, I kind of told him all along that man came from ape. So what do I say? So this is really interesting stuff because, first of all, my friend's a Buddhist, but he believes in science, and Buddhism doesn't quite talk about man so much, the creation of man, or even the creation of the universe, all that much. Although some said that there are sutras that talks about that. It's not, most people don't read them. But in any case, my friend's a Buddhist. Apparently, his kid must be studying in a private school, because in a public school, I think they don't talk about religion all that much. Although I could be wrong. And what he's struggling is really, to me, what he's struggling is really between Buddhism, science, and Christianity. And of course, I talk a great deal about that recently as well as in the past. But I thought it would be good to talk about this anyway, and I plan to talk about this in Cantonese as well this Friday when we have a weekly online exercise class. First of all, I think all three, whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, or science, I think of them as three different languages, right? I believe they're communicating the same thing. They just have three different ways of explaining it. So it's very difficult to have a conversation with someone when you don't understand the language. So it's very difficult for a Buddhist to talk about science unless he has science education. Very difficult for a scientist to reconcile between science and Christianity, and likewise it's very difficult for a Christian and a Buddhist to talk to each other because they all speak different language. And I think it's important that I personally believe that it's very important to learn other people's language. I being someone who is bilingual to begin with, I believe it's very, very important to learn someone's language in order to have a conversation, right? So this issue of this question of where man came from, whether Adam, the first man, was created by God, or whether he was the descendant of ape, right? Is a really, really interesting question. And unfortunately, the problem is that, to me, they're talking about two different issues, because it really comes back to who is man, right? Who is human? Who am I? And as I talked about in the past, you have to understand that the universe is made out of matters and energy, right? I talked a great deal about that in the past, about Einstein's E equal mc squared. That not only is there energy and matter in this universe, and only energy and matter in this universe, the two are even equivalent, right? That under certain circumstances, that energy can exist as matter, right? I talked about that in the past. So a human being, and for that matter, any being, any living being, can have both matter and energy, right? So for example, if I talk about me, Denny, my existence, I can talk about Denny as in material or Denny as in energy. And so, of course, the material is the body, right? Is everything I can touch and feel. Whereas Denny as energy is my consciousness, right? And in Buddhism, we actually are quite sophisticated in how we understand our consciousness. And in the past, I wrote about the eight consciousness, right? That the eight consciousness are the five consciousness that are created by our five sense organs: our eye, our ear, our nose, our tongue, and our body. And in addition is the mental formation, is the mental factor, which is the the consciousness of the mind, right? But there is more. So those are the six, and there are two more, right? There is the eighth consciousness, which is our, and then also the seventh consciousness, right? So so Buddhism talks about that as being, and that actually is energy, right? Scientists are now extrapolating, and they actually start to talk about consciousness as part of energy, perhaps in a very high state of energy. So you could have energy going as low in frequency as acoustic waves, sound, and then eventually light and radio wave, microwave, gamma wave, and then ultimately to consciousness. So that's energy. So we know that our existence consists of both form and nama, right? And form is what we call the Gaya, right? Our body, a material. And then in addition, it's the name, it's the consciousness. So when you talk about where we come from, and if I refer to my body, I think it's accurate to say that our body and the apes share a common ancestor, that we have similar DNA. I think that's perfectly okay, right? Because, I mean, if you look at the history of man, or even the history of civilization, we talk about the Chinese civilization. The written language started about 3,300 years ago, but the archaeologist thinks that the Chinese civilization back to the Stone Ages could be anywhere from 10,000 to 80,000 years, right? So that's what we would consider man, at least as far as the Chinese civilization concerns, are in that order, anywhere from 3,300 years, which is where the written language starts, to less than 100,000 years. But we know that when we talk about modern man, our nearest ancestor is someone who is what we call Homo sapien, right? Homo sapien is around 350,000 years. So that predates any Chinese civilization. But Homo sapien, the word sapien means wise, wisdom. So it really, what it means is that Homo sapiens are the beginning of the development of a brain. And that actually, interesting, coincides with the use of fire to cook, right? So the use of fire is about 400,000 years. So ever since man, or the ancestors of man, learned how to cook, they can digest both plant and meat much easier, right? Both the fat and the protein much easier. So it allows them to grow the brain disproportionate to the other species, and that's why humans start to develop into who we are. And so that's our first ancestors is Homo sapiens. So they're not apes anymore. They're human, right? But if you go back even further, when it's not so clear, when they were ape or man, that's Homo erectus. Erectus just means stand up straight, and that's about 2 million years. And And if you go back even further, I mean, when the ape and the monkey, when the man and the monkeys actually had a common ancestor, scientists think that that's about 16 million years, right? 16 or 17 million years. So, so I think if you want to talk about man, ape, that's as far as it goes, okay? But that's man as in the body of man, the material part of man. Now we know that there's more because one of the most important announcement from Buddha after he became enlightened was that he said all sentient beings, right? Sentient beings, as opposed to all living or life forms. So that's the difference between sentient beings and non-sentient beings. Is that a non-sentient beings could be like a vegetable. It just is something that has life, whereas there's living. Whereas a sentient beings is a human being, or animals, any kind of animals, any kind. I mean, it could be something as intelligent as an elephant, or a pet, a dog, or it could just be a worm or cockroaches. These are all sentient beings because they all have consciousness. And Buddha says after he became, the first thing he said after becoming enlightened is that all sentient beings have Buddha nature. In other words, not only are we capable of becoming Buddha, in fact, we were Buddha once. We were Buddha. We were originally Buddha. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that because of our delusion, our labeling, or our clinging, we are contaminated. We're now not free anymore. We're not. Our Buddha nature is strangled by these 5 hindrances. I talked about that in the past. So what that means is that if you were to talk about man as in a material form, I don't have any problem to say that we share the same common ancestor as ape. Okay. In fact, I would. But if you talk about our consciousness, our consciousness could come from many eons ago, right? When we were once enlightened beings, perhaps not even have a form. Okay, so when you talk about how does the scientist think about sentient beings? How was that developed? Well, long before there were ape. There were other animals, right? In fact, one of the things that I talk about is this quantity called kalpa. So if you talk about kalpa, and the way that Buddha had defined kalpa is if you start with 10, and every time you count to 100, you add 1, and then you count another 100, you count another 1 until you get to 84,000, and then you reverse the process until you get back to 10 again. That's 1 kalpa. And so if you do the numbers, that's about 17 million, and 17 million is about the time when the development of human had just deviated from the development of ape. And then similarly, if you talk about a medium kalpa, as I explained before, and that's about the development of the amphibians. Okay, so one of the things that in the Buddhist literature that talks about the 4 different ways that life form can come about. The first one is they can come about through fertilized eggs. Second is that they could come about through embryos. So these are mammals, right? So, and then finally they could come about in wet. I don't know how what's the English proper translation, but something that it was born in water. And the last one is that it could be through incarnation. Okay, So that's when a spirit takes on the body, a human body, like Jesus would you would argue would be the case. So if you look at that in the development, I mean, apes are obviously mammals, but long before that, there were different kind of mammals, right? There were, but before mammal, the fish and the bird and all that, and then so when they start to have fish and then eventually amphibians, that's about 335 million years ago, and so on and so forth. So you can talk about these other sentient beings, not just man. Okay, so I think if you were to think about where man came from, again, you go back to the question of man, where man came from. You can trace it back. You can go all the way as far as ape, and then all the way as far as amphibians, and then all the way as far as single cell amoeba, right? That's the entirety of living creatures on Earth. So that's when you talk about where man came from, as in material. So then the question is, where did man come from? Where did we come from? Well, in terms of our consciousness, well, I don't know where our consciousness come from. It could. I mean, everybody's different. I'm pretty sure that it didn't come from man. I mean, very rarely would you. I mean, think about how hard it is to come back samsara, to come back as man. It's very, very difficult to come back again as man. I mean, at the very minimum, you have to take the 5 precepts. That's what it says. If you don't take the 5 precepts, you will never come back as man. You will come back in the lower form. The lower form being animal, hungry ghost, and hell. I mean, that's it's written. Okay, so. But if you look at so in other words, how does that have to do with the Bible, right? So I talk about this in the past. So in the Bible, God created universe, and then God created Adam. Now it's very possible that He didn't just create a single human being called Adam. It could be that He created a village of human beings, all of them called Adam. We don't know. I mean, actually, the scholars are debating that. But it is true that when God created the first man, or the first group of men, He gave him very, very specific instruction that he was allowed to eat all the plants in the Garden of Eden, and not the animals. The animals are there for as his friend. It was written in the book of Genesis, but it was also written in the book of Genesis that there was one tree that he couldn't eat, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in my last video, I talk about that the scholars actually decided that that's just a figure of speech. In other words, because if you go back to the way the Hebrew language was spoken at the time, it meant the tree actually meant the tree of knowledge of everything. Okay, and actually the word knowledge has a different interpretation, and it could be discernment, discrimination. So in any case, it's the opposite of equanimity. I talk about that, and so because once you lose equanimity, then you would develop attachment or clinging to your senses, and then God says then you would die, which means that you would lose your eternal life, and then which means that you would fall from the higher realm where the spiritual beings live to the realm of the desire where we are, right? And who knows? I mean, you could become a cockroach for all I care, because that's what happens when you fall into the realm of the desire. that you have some that's samsara, right? That every life comes back in a different form. It could be human being one time. It could be animal the second time. It could even be a diva, right? And it could be any one of the six. So it's an interesting question. It's a very important question to ask. Who was the first man? And if the first man were Adam, was Adam an ape? Did Adam evolve from an ape, or was Adam created by God? It's a very important question because it depends on who you think Adam is. Is Adam the form, or is Adam the nama? Right? If you're thinking of the body as Adam, or if you're thinking yourself as your existence is just your body, then you share this DNA with the ape. But if you think of your existence as your spirit, as your consciousness, as your Buddha nature, well, then once upon a time, you were a spiritual being, just like Adam, living, in the Garden of Eden, outside of the desire realm, right? But because of one reason or another, lifestyle choices, you picked up some bad habits like like clinging and attachment and aversion and doubt and all that, right? All five of the hindrances. Then you fall into samsara, okay? And if you're lucky, you fall into the body of man. And so if you're not so lucky, then you fall into something else. So it's a very, very interesting question. I'm not sure the answer is good enough for a 10-year-old though. But it is good enough for a parent. Okay, thank you.